of these talks, I'll be happy to take questions. Right? So, but those are very useful and I think helpful points to discuss. So we talked about OCT and geography earlier, and now we're going back to our workhorse, which is the OCT. And I'd like to share a bit about some pearls and pitfalls on how we interpret OCT. Now, unlike OCTA, I would dare say that OCT is something that all of us are using. Right? Is there anyone here who doesn't use OCT? Hopefully not. Okay. I mean, I was just relating my experience, although I may be carbon dating myself, when I was a junior consultant running the general clinic with my medical officers and residents, when the resident came and said, there's this patient with previously treated for diabetic macular edema, came for follow-up, vision is good, there's clinically no significant macular edema. Oh, but I'm going to send for an OCT anyway. And I just frowned and said, why are you sending for an OCT? It's clinically normal, right? So, why waste the investigation? Now, that was the day. Today, in my clinic, if the patient walks in with no OCT, my question is probably a bit more frustrated, curt tone. Why has an OCT been done? So it's a very different thing. In fact, I have a standing instruction to my team to screen all the patients. Anyone with no pupil dilation, this is a retina clinic, right? With no pupil dilation and no OCT, please alert me. I will review. Maybe there's a reason for that, but if not, we're going to do it first. Saves time anyway. Okay. So sorry, Clement, we don't check the pupils in retina clinics. So I know that's probably not there. But okay, so OCT. Well, again, just same acknowledgements. OCT has really come a long way from the first OCT image in the retina, all the way to first time domain, spectral domain, swab source, and now OCTA. This is just a rough timeline. And again, I'm young enough to remember the time when OCT was deemed as a kind of an unusual investigation, just as OCTA is today. Right? So in fact, someone has described and once said, and I think it's a useful thing to think about, that for OCTA, we are in the time domain era of OCTA. So we're in the same era when we just had time domain OCT. So that's where we are. All right. So and we're looking forward to the spectral domain, the swab source era, and of course the OCTA era of OCTA, if that's such a thing. Right? But it's really come a long way in a very short time. And our understanding of this has changed as well. Whereas once we use OCT just as something to look at and just one value, all right? I remember our clinical notes going, retinal thickness 350, arrow 325, decrease, plan, improving, assessment improving, plan, whatever, all right? That's quite different from what we do nowadays. So with current spectral domain OCTs and of course swab source, we can see all the various layers of the retina. Much better certainly than time domain, and better than clinical examination in some ways as well. So there are different layers, and remember that it's not only the retina and the RPE, but what lies beneath, the choroid. We can now see the choroid very well, and choroidal thickness is an important area because it gives us some indication of what the disease may be. For example, CSCR typically has a thickened choroid. PCV may have a thickened choroid, whereas AMD has a thinner choroid compared to normals. So that's indicative. But it's not only the thickness, it's also the quality of the choroid. What it appears as. Some are more vascularized, some have just a lot of stroma, and these are all important considerations. So, we all know OCT, but just a quick recap. How is this an advantage? It is also non-invasive. There's no intravenous access required. There's no dye injection required. It's non-contact. You don't touch the patient. It is obviously rapid. It's comfortable for the patient. It's typically non-mydriatic, meaning you can do an OCT on an undilated pupil. But sometimes, especially if there's medial opacity or other factors, you may, or very small pupil, you may want to try and dilate it to get a better image. Certainly, if your image quality is suffering and you're doing non-linear interactively, then you may want to consider dilation. Right? But certainly, this has advantages over other more time-consuming things like angiograms. So when do we do an OCT? I mean, this is really what we all do, right? During initial review of a patient, where indicated, you might do an OCT. And sometimes you might pick up things that you don't see clinically, all right? But that I wouldn't go so far as to say I'll do this on everybody that walks in. You come in for a chalazion and I'm going to do an OCT on your eye, right? I mean, no good reason for that. But if there's enough reason for review, I will do an OCT. Sometimes it's a baseline. Obviously, to help me make the diagnosis. It may be apparent clinically, it may be apparent on other tests that I will do, but usually after clinical examination, the next thing I'll go on to an OCT, and if necessary, then an angiogram. So with the OCT, I may be able to at least have a good sense of the diagnosis, and the angiogram gives me different information. We'll talk more about that during the multimodal imaging aspect. But it's certainly helpful. And even if clinically I'm convinced of the diagnosis, I sometimes want this as a baseline to see how this changes. This goes to the next point about monitoring for progression. If you don't have a previous OCT, you can't tell what today's OCT is like relative to the previous visit. You can go by clinical impression if you remember correctly, if you document it accurately, but you won't have any to compare against. Right? So very important if you want a baseline. If you want to compare, you need a baseline. And of course, treatment response is very, very important. Some patients with DME, for example, AMD, there's a lot of fluid, a lot of hemorrhage. We can see this clinically. Frankly, we don't need an OCT to tell us our clinical skills are enough to pick it up. But how many times have we seen a patient where actually, frankly, clinically, you can't really tell, or maybe I'm just not that good, but on the OCT, you see some activity. Okay, so it changes our paradigm, but of course, that's also the question. Are we treating the OCT or are we treating the patient? Right? The days when we treated clinically significant macular edema was just that clinical examination compared to now we're treating basically center involving DME. Quite different things. So we're used to patterns, and these are just two common examples of patterns, but just for the sake of a recap and a refresher, this is what we'll typically call a raster pattern, where the scan line goes from here, from left to right, and then it goes down, and so on. And sometimes referred to as a cube scan as well. The benefit of this is that the scan points are evenly spaced. In contrast, over here, these are the radial scans, which is of course something that one of the major scans we had on the time domain. It is still an option, and it still has its uses. But the radial scan is there, and this is how it appears on the fundus. Radial scans are concentrated at the fovea, and you approach it from different angles. That can be useful, but as it gets further away, the distance between the two widens. So if there's a lesion in between the two lines, you're not going to get it, right? If it's right at the fovea, you're going to get different cuts through it. It's like looking at things from a different angle. In contrast, the raster scan is evenly spaced. So you have a much higher chance, or at least an equal chance of spotting something at the fovea as in the one of the corners. But remember, something I'll mention again, the number of cuts in between the lines can vary. Most machines allow you to vary that. That's an important consideration. Okay. You can have very widely spaced scans. This one is spaced out, the drawing to illustrate the point, but you can have widely spaced scans. And that may be good enough if you're looking for generalized edema, CSCR. You don't expect some variation in between the lines. But for small lesions, you might miss, because the lesion, if this were the actual spacing of the lines and the small lesion is small enough and sits between the lines, you can miss it. Okay, so that's a very important consideration. And therefore, you need to also be aware of the spacing of the light. requirements and what you need. One caveat again is that I tend to be more fussy with my imaging requirements, or at least I have a higher requirements, which sometimes doesn't make me very popular with the imaging department. As I was sharing over tea, I think it's important that you base it on your clinical decision, because you are answerable for that. Last point I'll make, besides the scans, you can also vary the width of the scans, meaning that this is probably about 20 by 20 degrees, or you can actually potentially go wider, or if you really want to concentrate on only one small area, you can even narrow the scan, right? But realize that if you have a wider area, if you have closer space scans, each of these will add to your acquisition time, which can make the patient get tired. It makes your technician get tired of you. All right. Yeah, I know. Whenever they see OCT requests from Colin Tan, oh my gosh. All right. So, all right, when it's the only other, I won't name. There's only one other person who's been more fussy than me. I think the Singaporeans will know who they are, who it is. But essentially, it depends on what you need. So how would we assess an OCT? This is just an example of a printout, and I will also urge you, I'll come back to this point, I'll urge you not to just rely on a printout. A printout may be fine for documentation, for providing a report, if you're giving, let's say, a report to the patient or for the patients. Some patients will say, every time they come in, can I have a copy of the scan, right? And obviously, if you have 60 lines or 120 lines of OCT, you're going to print out 120 cuts. And they wouldn't, frankly, most of them wouldn't know what to do with it. Okay? And if it's an ophthalmologist seeing me for a retinal problem, I'll try to refer him, anyway, to Adrian or something. But, so what patients want is they just want this. They just want this thing to show them, keep for their records or to show their relatives, which is fine, which is perfectly fine. But for ourselves, as ophthalmologists, it would be important not to just rely on this. Right? And that's one of the things I will come back to. But when you look at the print, or when you look at the scan, however it's displayed, you need a few things. You need to look at the identifiers, make sure it's the correct patient. In this day and age, when you just click on something, it's very, very easy to click on the wrong name, right? Especially if there are two people with similar sounding names. Happens commonly. Right? So you need to check that it's the correct patient. Then you can look at the overall image, because this gives you a clue. And you will want to look at the OCT B scans, the cross sections, all right, and ideally scroll through the entire sequence. So you need the software to view it. Either it's a remote access to the clinic room, or you may need to go to the machine. I know that's difficult, I know that's inconvenient. I still experience that in some cases, but that's what you need to do. One scan may not tell you the whole picture. Then, of course, how about one other factor to consider is the signal strength. Many devices, most devices will have some kind of signal strength index. Of course, the numbers vary. For Zeiss, for example, it goes up to 10. So 10 is perfect. Right? For Heidelberg, 10 would be rather low. Right? Because in double digits is in decibels. So you need to be familiar, but beyond just a number, look at the scan itself. Are you happy with the scan? All right? It doesn't matter if the signal strength is 7 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. But something's not right. It can be 4 out of 10 and you can still get useful information. So that's something though you might want to take note of. Then of course, you can look at the thickness map. Thickness map is like an overview. It just highlights to you, well, what do I see? I'm sure you're familiar with the normal thickness map of a normal eye, where there's a blue patch where the foveal dimple goes in, right? And there's an orangey like donut around it, which is the parafoveal retina. Obviously, you look at this and you realize that, well, something's off here. So that at a glance gives you an indication. But then you need to correlate with this. How about the retinal thicknesses and volumes especially? Does anyone use volumes here? Anyone? Right? I mean, it's a bit difficult and to get even a sense of what the volumes are. But yes, some people will still look at the retinal thicknesses. And yes, it does tell you something. 451 is definitely not normal. Okay? But that is quantitative. It's useful if you want to measure. And it's still done obviously for clinical trials, right? They always talk about central retinal thickness, central subfield thickness. and how it changes with the drug, right? This drug makes it go down faster, blah, 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 and stays down, and sawtooth appearances, all of that. So that's useful, but in clinical practice, I'm not treating a number. Again, I mentioned, what if it's 451 and last time and now is now 437? Is that good enough, or is that not good enough? Right? So sometimes it's, you have to take that with a pinch of salt. But so in general, these are the things you would want to look for on an OCT scan. So just to summarize, please make sure the correct patient is done on the correct date, correct eye obviously, and the correct scan location. Oh, correct eye is not something, if you sound, first of all, you could be looking at the wrong eye. All right, I don't know, maybe I'm just not that bright, I suppose, but sometimes, sometimes in clinics like, which eye are we talking about, right? Right? Just, it's right and left, you have 50% chance of guessing right, guessing correctly, anyway, right? But the fact is that, some people do get confused. But how many times have some people been thrown off by a fundus photo taken on the nasal retina and they mistake it for the other eye, right? So be careful of that. The correct scan location is important as well. You assume focus on the macula. Sometimes patients may not cooperate, or they may have the patient may look to the other side for some other reason. So you have to make sure you know where you're looking at. I mentioned already the scan quality. I think quality is more important. Basically, are you confident, are you comfortable in assessing the quality, assessing pathology on this? Right? So it doesn't matter if the signal strength is very high, but 1/3 of the OCT is in shadow because the pupil margin got in the way. There's a bit of medial opacity from cataract. All right, so that part is still unreadable. So be careful of this. And segmentation lines. If you're going to rely on retinal thicknesses, you will need accurate segmentation lines. So it's something that you may want to look at. Okay, so when you interpret an OCT, my recommendation is we have to do it systematically. And I think, of course, obviously, all of us experienced clinicians will, after a while, we do it like almost instinctively and subconsciously. We don't exactly have to remember step 1, step 2, just like when we do a cataract surgery or even when we examine a patient, I don't have to remind myself, look at the cornea. Actually, the joke is that for retina, we just want the cornea to be clear enough so we can see the back. Okay. And but still, look at all the structures. But we're doing this instinctively, whereas a beginner, of course, will be saying, remember, check the conjunctiva, check the eyelids, check this, check that, right? But we're just sweeping through, isn't it? So the same thing with OCT, all right? But sometimes you forget or you develop bad habit of shortcuts. So, but important, look at all the OCT scans. If there are more than one scan done, sometimes the technician will zoom in on a certain area, either by the initiative or because it's been instructed. But it's very important to look at all the scans. Okay? And the quantitative measures, as I mentioned, may or may not come in helpful. I think it does give you some indication, but certainly I would not recommend that as a primary consideration in decision on whether to treat or not. How about limitations of OCT? Don't worry, there will be examples. I'm just trying to give overview first, and then we're going to go into specific examples. But what are some of the limitations? First of all, as you know, an OCT is static. So you do not see blood flow through an OCT. Even the OCTA, remember, you're seeing a vessel flow map. You're not actually seeing the vessel go through like you would in a dynamic angiogram or early phases of a flash angiogram. OCT definitely does not show leakage. So you can see fluid, or what appears to be fluid. It may not represent leakage itself. The field of view is, again, consideration. Okay, what's the widest you can get? About 12 millimeters across. That's still a relatively small area of the posterior pole. Okay, so medial opacity can certainly affect this. So I just saw a patient who I was monitoring. He has AMD with a bit of submacular scar in one eye, RPE rib. So relatively poor vision. And So he's got guarded prognosis on that eye, but I performed cataract surgery on him because he had cataract with PSC component as well, so posterior subcapsular cataract. So that was obstructing the OCT, so much so that I'm just getting a bit of static and gray pixels. So I can't assess, although that's a poorer eye, I discussed with him and said, sometimes when he does develop fluid, he still has worsening of vision. When I do inject, the cysts go away, the fluid goes away, and he improved. So on those grounds, I think it makes sense obviously, and he was happy to go through that. But yeah, be aware that medial opacity can certainly affect this. Corneal scars can affect this. Obviously, vitreous hemorrhage is not going to be very amenable to an OCT scan, right? There are limitations. As I mentioned, you may require pupil dilation. So if you do a scan and through an undilated pupil, if you're not intending to dilate and view the rest of the retina anyway for whatever reason, then it's fine. You can go through undilated pupil. Often works, but if there's any problem, it's a very small pupil, if there's a medial opacity, especially for example a posterior subcapsular cataract right in the center, tends to be central, right? Then you may be able, if you dilated the pupil, to go around it, to steer the scan just a bit around it to get a better quality view. So it's worth a try at least. So let's go through some examples, and perhaps I would like a bit, in some cases, of interaction as well from this to tell me what do you think could be done better for some of these. But so here are some pitfalls of OCT interpretation. So this is one example. This is one of my patients. Of course, I've backed out the identity, but you can see this patient has had multiple OCT scans. Okay, this patient has AMD, and so she comes in on AMD on the right eye. She's been treated with aflibercept every 3 months. Actually, she ideally should be less than that, but she can only come in once in 3 months. Or was willing to come in once in 3 months. Essentially, imagine she's here today. So she comes in, right? And you view her on the computer monitor. So what will you do? You just double click here, and then you open it and you assess. And well, let's look at this. The words may be a bit small, but trust me, it says 13th of August, which is obviously not today. Well, granted, it was about 1 or 2 weeks ago, but I think it illustrates the point. Right? Because this very patient was treated by me once. She had more worsening fluid and edema. So I told her, okay, basically she doesn't want injections because she's afraid of the cost. She responds best to aflibercept, so we're going with that. But obviously, the cost is a thing concern for her. Her children are willing to pay, but she's just, old folks who say, oh no, don't waste money, let it go fine, it's okay. But anyway, we eventually always have to go through that conversation that persuade her. But I treated her at this point, and at that point she was on monthly injections. I treated her because she had bad edema, okay, and it was worsening. So I gave her a jab and I said, I'll see you in 1 month and I'll review. So she came in 1 month later, right, and it always feels just like yesterday, like, weren't you just here last week or something? But she came in again and it was 1 month. And what I did was I examined her. And I always advise my residents, examine the patient. You're not treating the scan, you're treating the patient. Find out what's their vision, find out, see what they're feeling subjectively, examine them, then review this. That's my own thought. I mean, I'm open to disagreement on this, and I'd be happy to hear your views, but this is what I do, and I will always tell those with me in my clinic. Many times though, when I walk into the room, before the patient has even walked in, they open the OCT scan and tell me, yeah, I need to jet this patient, right? It's a faster way I run through that because the patient will be elderly, coming in slowly, etc. But you already have a preconceived notion. But in any case, let's talk about this patient. So she came in, I examined her, as is my practice, and I smiled at her and said, good, that is better. I also checked the VA, right? I looked at the VA. VA was better. I looked at it and said, good, you're doing better. Then I swung to the computer and said, let me have a look at your scan. I just opened this and I went click on this, it opened up. And then that's when I started to frown. I was like, wait a minute. Because I remember her, she's my patient, I'm seeing her every month at that time. So I remembered roughly what her findings were, and I said, it's definitely better, clinically. Especially, and also compared to what I documented in the notes. But when I looked at the OCT scan, that was wrong. It was terrible, it was bad, it was fluid. So I frowned and finally I just muttered, which by the way, maybe not a good idea, but I just said something. She speaks Mandarin, but I said to her, I just said, something's not right here. Maybe it's my ego, right? Like, how could I be so wrong? But then she offered something. She says, today, no scan was done. Because at least on Untitled software, and I think on many softwares, the most recent one is there. But if no scan is done today, it's not going to be there. Now, granted, I should have checked. So that's on me, I should have checked. But I instinctively just went in and just opened the most recent scan. So it was ordered, it just wasn't done. Let's not go into why. Some heads rolled because of that, but never mind. But it wasn't done. But if you don't check this, you can make mistakes. Of course, if your clinic is set up such that it's always done when you order it, then that's fine. But at some point, patient will forget, patient will just come straight to your room and so on. But also, I think that also illustrates the point. I personally feel, and again, I would like to hear your opinions on this if you have a different view. But that's why I always tell my juniors, examine the patient first. And of course, hone your examination skills. Because if you can do that, then you realize, no, this doesn't fit. Of course, another possibility is the wrong patient, right? It could be somebody who came in, leaned behind my back and opened up another scan just to view it and then left it on that patient. Okay, so, but that's one thing. So remember, check identifiers and dates. Very important. That's unfortunately not a common pitfall. Okay, and you can of course save yourself by looking on one hand, but also having the instinct to say, no, it doesn't fit. Something's not right. Incidentally, in that case, for that patient on that day, because she was on a PRN, when she went for a scan, there was no fluid. Right? So this was 1 month after injection. So she didn't, and she opted for PRN. So no injection. All right. So that's the difference: inject versus don't inject. Imagine that. And can you imagine if I had injected her, if she hadn't known better, and there was no, well, I could have said, first of all, my clinical impression was no disease activity, no OCT scan. Then the question could be, why did you inject her, right? So that's one of the things to be careful about. Right? Printouts. So again, I discussed printouts. We went through, and again, this is something that is very useful for some overviews. All right. But what I would say is, do not rely only on the printouts. Okay. As an example, I know it shows both scans, but look at this. This cut here, which is the vertical cut, shows cysts on one side, probably a BRVO because this portion is normal. All right, but if you were to rely on this, you might argue, well, I see 1 or 2 cysts there. But at least your assessment of this scan versus this scan would have been quite different. Would you agree? Your impression of the activity. So don't rely on this. Of course, you can say, well, guess what? I can look at this. I see that big red bump there. I look at this thickness band. This whole thing is pink. Yes, you can. I agree. But I would still think that the most important thing is we can view this. And on the Zeiss machine, you have what, 128 or 256, depending on the settings, cuts to go through. I know that's a lot. But why are we just relying on 1 or 2 cuts if that's the case? Why do we then bother to do the other cuts? So I think one of the pitfalls is to do that, and my suggestion is review the entire OCT scan. Okay? Something like so, and each of these gives you, so it looks fine so far, but there we go. Right? Do you see that? So only a bit of subretinal fluid on some cuts. Of course, that was more central, but what if the fluid were inferior? Okay. I mentioned also to look at the on-fast image. That's usually an infrared image. This can give you some clues. Okay. Another example which happened somewhere, I won't name the guilty, but basically, and I know why, because I examined the patient later. This patient was being followed up for diabetic macular edema, and it was reviewed. The patient had a bit of, senile ptosis, not the most cooperative, looks all over the place during examination. But the person who saw documented no clinical evidence of edema, great, and on OCT was normal. All of which was correct, by the way. All of which was correct. And if I had just relied, so sometimes I will, especially in a busy clinic, if the person experienced, I'll say, okay, so you examine, you don't find anything, OCT scan looks okay, fine, let's go. But I happened to look at this, and what did I see? Something below the cut. Remember I mentioned if it's outside the range of your OCT scan, either laterally, vertically, or height-wise, you might miss it. There was something dark here, with a kind of a straight line and then a bit of a boat shape. Patient had a pre-retinal hemorrhage. Right? And why was that missed? Because patient not cooperative. Granted, I agree the patient not cooperative. We've all had patients, right? Moving eyes everywhere, you get 1.5 second view at a time. Senile ptosis, lids getting in the way, blah blah blah, tearing. It's difficult, but this was the clue. So yes, there was no macular edema. The DME was under control, but the diabetic retinopathy had progressed, and there was a clue. Now, I'm not suggesting you use OCT on fast images to look for hemorrhages. That's not my point. But my point is, you have this info, use it. Okay. As I said, if it's here or up there, the scan will not show it. Actually, technically, it did involve the very last line. But how many of us look at the last line? So when we look carefully, and it was visible. There was no edema. See, again, you see what you're looking for. They were looking for fluid. They were looking for cysts. They were looking for thickening. They didn't see that pre-retinal hyperreflectivity, which was the hemorrhage. So unfortunately, I can't recall that patient, so I can't find the scan to show you. But trust me, I think you can imagine what I'm describing. All right, this was the first clue. Now, if I had examined, would I have spotted it? I hope so. But the fact is, it was a difficult patient. Okay, but this makes you look more carefully. Of course, you might, and by the way, you might be saying, wait a minute, but that's only if it's here in the arcades. What if it's beyond the arcades? Granted, I grant you that. Okay, there is one VR surgeon in my department who advocates lying every patient down and doing indented examination of ora serrata for everybody, including DME. So that's the other extreme. I'll leave you to decide whether you agree with that. Suffice to say, I don't exactly agree. Not the ora serrata. Okay, so that's very important. Also, I mentioned to you, this one has 31 cuts. This is one of the settings on the Heidelberg. It is at least wide, but there are gaps. Of course, you do not expect a pre-retinal hemorrhage to exist only between two lines. That's true, but or even something like a tiny lesion. All right, I think some of you have asked about uveitis. Some very focal inflammatory lesions could be small enough to hide in between. Okay, so that's one thing. Okay, so one other point I'll make of this before we move on is I talked about small lesions. So, as you know, some OCT machines have follow-on capabilities. All right, it's useful because if you want to follow up the region, you can have point-to-point registration. There are it's good, it's very good, but there are limitations, especially for small lesions. So, I saw a patient once with some presumed inflammation, where there was almost at the fovea some mild inflammatory lesion, and on the repeat scan 1 week later, it was down, considerably down, which was fine, except that we had 2 scans done on that same eye on that day. Looking at the other scan, that lesion was still there. Just that the difference was there was this type of scan and there was one with the finer cuts. Okay. It was missed on this, even on follow-up, because there was slight movements, there can be slight shifts, but it was seen on the wider, on the denser cuts, because you have it's got less space to hide, let's put it that way. Okay. Which of course explains why 31 scans is usually not my favorite, although I know some technicians will disagree with me and hate me for this one. Alright, so okay. And any comments so far? I mean, these are some of my thoughts and experiences of how it doesn't mean that it's entirely right, and you may have different ways, or you may want to either go further or say, nah, let's not do that. Okay. So please feel free, or we can talk about it during Q&A as well. Now, thickness maps, I mentioned that's something that we want to look at. So this is an example of a patient where you can have the thickness maps. So you see that the reference from May, the previous time the patient had a scan, and then in August. And what do you see? You see 525, 565, and even on the color map, you do see some changes. So that can be an indication, but and in fact, that was the practice, especially during time-moving days, possibly because we didn't understand enough, and very likely because in those days, at least in my department, we just had one printout with one slice, one section, so that's all we had to go on. So of course, we had to rely on this, but this doesn't entirely tell all the picture. All right, so remember that looking at this may be important, but it's not the only thing. All right, so you need to look qualitatively. This was the previous one. You can see some scarring, a bit of cyst, but look at it, it's obviously worse now. Intraretinal cyst, the retina is thicker, and the subretinal fluid. Right? So all of this tells you more than just a change in the value of the central subfield thickness. Would I be more worried about this or this? But the fact is, I can tell that the cysts have increased. I can tell that the subretinal fluid, and there was none before. Of course, remember there's only one cut. Other cuts to go by. And do you notice also that unlike the previous map, where you see the individual lines, you don't see here because it's 61 cuts. All right, that's my typical setting. You can go higher, by the way, but technicians will probably, try to eat you up with some dark alley or something. So, but 61 is still, I think, reasonable enough. Okay. Can I get someone brave to shout out the diagnosis in this case? What does this patient have? And by the way, it may not be PCV. I know I'm keen on PCV, but during the recent exams, when we took our residents for exams, I described it was a viable scenario. I described this patient comes with chronic blurring of vision for 6 months, and the first diagnosis some of them rattled out was PCV. I said, look, just because it's me taking an exam doesn't mean the answer is PCV. Okay? It was a macular hole. So anyway, someone? It could be PCV though. Who knows? Sorry? Sir, poor scan. Okay, so nothing. Okay, so you need to see the OCT, right? Well, at least this part is normal. Okay, at least this part is normal. And this is why, because of the segmentation errors. You see this part is in shadow. This is a young patient. It's normal eyes. He's a myope, but then again, myopia is not exactly bad, right? There's a shadow here, but look at the segmentation. This automated segmentation assumed that the RPE, the Brooks membrane, was here. So for some reason, the algorithm, it was correct so far, and then it just jumped down and went there. This part is an error too as well. Okay? And this is why you get a thickness map like this. This obviously is unusable. Oh, by the way, of course, the photo actually looks alright. But this is an illustration why, if you want to use numerical value, you have to be very careful. Okay. You can, of course, correct this, but it is tedious and painful, especially, well, it was 31 cuts. Right? Obviously didn't follow my instructions, but if you try correcting this, yes, you will get a nicer map, but are you going to do that? Can you do that in clinic? And if you do it, what are you going to do? Just get a nicer map. It doesn't make sense, right? So obviously, I think the qualitative interpretation is still more important. Okay. So how about this? Let's look at this. Same patient, 2 visits. 205. Sorry?
Different machines.
Different machines. Good. So you might assume it's different use of pathology if you didn't think carefully, but it's because one of them was done using time domain, stratus OCT, and the other was done using a spectral domain. Okay? So what would happen is a different machine is used within the same institution. Patient goes from one institution to another, comes to you for second opinion, you having a time domain, or just a different machine. It doesn't only mean time domain versus spectral domain. Right? So even say a Cirrus and a Spectralis and a TopCon have different measurements on record thickness. You can't entirely compare them. Right? So that's a very important thing. So again, if we don't realize this and you just go with numbers, that's how you can sort of get caught up. What made you recognize? What was the clue that? Is there anything that clue on this? The map looks a bit different, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. So that's one of the things. Of course, sometimes the display changes as well, but nonetheless, the point is this: don't be careful what machine was used. Okay. If you look at this. This is the blow-up of the central thickness. 241 sounds reasonable, but that's because the lesion is outside. Okay, so this patient, I think, if I recall, had a BRVO, a bit of swelling there. But if you think about it, sure, there's something going on there. At least based on the color map, thickness map. But it's just outside that zone. So if you look at this, that's fine. But if you look at the thickness here, then you might find something. Okay, so again, that shows some of the limitations of the thickness map. Basically, it's just by regions, isn't it? Right? So it's just in a way, it's a division. An ETDRS grid is something we've been using for a long time, but it's still nonetheless an artificial division. So it's like trying to say, what's the difference between this half of the room and this half of the room? Are there more males and females in one, and blah blah blah? Some younger, is the mean age younger? But it's just because it's the way the chairs were arranged and where you decided to sit today, isn't it? So be careful of that. Anyone? Patient's vision is 6'6", asymptomatic. What is that? It could be normal. Don't see anything, right? I'm sorry? Don't necessarily see it, but maybe, but if you look at the retina, it looks fine, right? I don't see anything. To me, this is normal. How about this? Same thing. Someone want to shout it out? Where? Here?
Yeah.
That could be just a bit of that's the RFNL, that could be still okay.
Easy and IC are not
Exactly. You see, this is the easy band, formerly known as the ISOS. That's the photoreceptor band. And what happens? It's gone. Yeah, well, okay, but the correct does sort of thicken a bit temporarily, right? But yes, it could be a bit thickened, but actually, if you look carefully, very carefully now, with 20/20 hindsight, right? But no, I would not have called it. I would have attributed this to a bit of quality and the periphery of the scan, wouldn't you? I mean, seriously, honestly, even in 29, who would call this abnormal? Think about it. You wouldn't, right? Honestly. But this is what happens when you get a wider scan. So, of course, you need to know what you're looking for, but be careful. If you get a narrow scan, you're going to have potential limitations. If the pathology is all here, it's fine. And of course, you could be saying, well, I only care about the fovea. No, we're not foveal specialists, right? Okay. There's a lot more to the eye. Okay. So, see that? Same thing, by the way. Very important. Okay. And this patient has, what do you think the patient has on a HPF? I'm sorry, I didn't get. Actually, it was a plaquenil toxicity in this case, but yeah, but it could be, right? The point is that there was abnormality. But if you rely on this, if we rely on this, you will continue to say, oh, normal, until if it expands further in, right? So that's the illustration. Of course, does that mean, and I think your technicians will not like me to probably say, who's that idiot who told you this, and you go back to your practice. But does that mean everybody gets a wider scan with as many cuts as you can? Not necessarily. That's what you need to use your clinical judgment. You know what you're looking for. Okay? And decide what's good for you, for your practice, for your type of patients. And do not be afraid to send them back for a repeat scan. Because it's a short walk, jet mostly, I think, and it's only a few seconds to perform a scan. So if you're in doubt, do not hesitate. But depending on what you're looking for, you need to look very carefully, right? So, and remember that even if this scan were normal, there could be other regions of the retina, superior, inferior, to look for. So, very important. So this is important to get the big picture, okay? And not just to focus only on one small area. How does this, I know we're talking OCTs, but how does this angiogram look to you? Small. I was too lazy to expand it. You probably know there's some trick involved, right? I'm not that sloppy with my slides. No financial interest with doctors. But seriously, this though is a wide OCT scan, so at least a 30-degree scan on the hydrophobe, right? This is about what you're going to get. Maybe a bit more if you use a swept source down millimeters, maybe, but the pathology could be elsewhere, isn't it? Okay, I mean, this is, caveat, I probably can't, by the way, when I give the printout, I'll try to remove this photo because it's just lifted off the web, but I think it's a very illustrative point. Okay? And so, I mean, and again, I know we're deviating a bit, but remember that the retina, there's a lot more to it than even the ETDRS7 fields. And your OCT scan covers this region. You can try and steer if you've got a cooperative patient, and in this case, you would definitely need a dilated pupil. If you think there's something here, look for it. Okay, you can, but be careful. That's one of the limitations of OCT. Okay, it's even a limitation, frankly, of examination. Okay, I had a patient with PCV who was on follow-up. He had been treated by me. He was stable. And he came for a routine, regular follow-up. I think he was at 4 to 5 monthly, partly because he wanted that longer duration. Otherwise, I'll see them a bit shorter anyway. And his macula was fine. But guess what? So, third-year resident examined and said, macula normal, OCT is normal. Can I see you back in 4 months to 5 months? So I was just, one of my first-year residents, very good chap, was taking his about to go for his primary and med, so I think the Singaporeans will be familiar. So just going for primary and med. And I said, let's examine this patient. Okay, by the way, I knew, and he looked temporally about here, and there was a large hemorrhagic PP at these three disc areas. It has to do with thoroughness. maybe frankly not at this point over here, not even skill, but if you don't look, you're not going to find it. Okay. So obviously, I was very impressed with the first year. The third year, not so much. Okay. It's just unfortunate that they saw on the same day, nonetheless. But seriously, and you know what happened to the patient? Shortly thereafter, in fact, we initiated treatment, but he bled breakthrough VH, and he said he's had a long history of VH after that. So, but guess what? It could have been seen in 5 months if you hadn't looked carefully. OCT isn't going to cover this, but again, I just want to make the point whether and this may be perhaps more relevant for multimodal reading, but please remember the size and scale of things are quite important. So I think some of you will have seen this. What's wrong with this scan here? Okay, well, there are quite a number of things wrong, but what's the arrow trying to show? Yeah, so it's a very high myop. So the scan depth of the OCT has implications, okay? And once it gets to this point, this is not because the eye has folded over on itself. Okay? I mean, if anyone has seen any of this, unless you did a terrible buckle or something, right? If anyone has seen this, please let me know. I'll be curious to see what that case is. This actually continues up there, but it's a reflection. Okay, so this is an artifact, and of course it also means that it's all reversed, isn't it? But be very careful when you see something like this, and obviously you must know when to steer this. One little tip on this is if you want. Okay, this one's actually going through this, but let's assume the fovea is still at the center here. Assuming it's going through the macula. If you wanted to concentrate on this, you know this is high myop. One thing you can do is to narrow the scan. Because when you have a wider scan, it takes the entire curvature into account. It's like the Earth, right? The Earth is round, all right? Unless anyone wants to dispute that. But when we are walking here, we don't feel it to be round, is it? Because it's a very small part of the whole surface. Okay, so that's one of the tips. So here's a case where I would advocate narrowing the width of the skin. Okay, so yes, so I can be flexible about. I'm not always all bigger and bigger is better. Okay, so that's one of the things you got to watch out for. But sure, as long as you recognize this, then that's fine. Okay. Anyone notice anything about this? I grant you I'm only giving you one cut. Fovea is thin, okay? Right. And there's a bit of disruption of the easy band there, okay? Right? So it's thin, good point, good pickup. When this was referred, the question was, why is this part of the retina thickened? Right? But it happens, right? That's what people will assume, because you're just thinking of relative, right? If you're tall, then I appear shorter, but if you're this short, then I'm tall. You see? So it's all relative. And again, you need to look at quality, not just quantity, right? Besides which, there's a range of thickness for retina. This is well within normal, isn't it? So yeah, things like this have happened. So for example, patient has visual loss and they're looking for edema fluid because that's the most common thing, right? And then I'll get a report. This patient referred to us, the retina is not thickened. And then I'll look at it, and there's only, in some cases, more severe than the toxicity case, there's only one little bit of easy band here because patient has advanced RP or some other dystrophy, some other toxicity, right? So so I once said to someone, no, it's not thickened. Like, yeah, it's definitely not thickened. It's thin. So think of the opposite as well. And it's sometimes useful to compare with the other eye, because when you compare, then you get a sense. It looks different, doesn't it? In this case, of course, there's some cystic changes here, which is the other question. So this patient's incoming to my clinic, so I'll let you know the next time we meet what it was. Anyone has any ideas? I'm not sure what it is yet. I have to see the patient and I just glanced at the scan, said fine, force it in. I got like 50 patients or whatever already. Just make it 51. Couldn't do it. Okay, but anyway, so that's the point. Remember that it's not just thickening, it's thinning as well. So here's the next point, all right, that you heard this phrase, right, that all animals are equal, but some are not equal and others. And that goes the same with findings on OCT. Not all bright or hyper-reflective or hypo-reflective spots are the same thing. In fact, they can mean many different things. Okay? So when you look at OCT, yes, I agree with you. Sometimes by pattern recognition, you can say, this thing is hyper-reflective and it looks like whatever. This is hyper-reflective and suddenly seems to be whatever. I agree, I fully agree. But that is not always the case. And something of equal intensity, and remember intensity can vary just by the gain, the settings that you set, as well as by the patient's cooperation. It varies even from visit to visit. Be careful of that. But not all spots are the same. Okay, so during some imaging rounds, it's usually the juniors who make the mistakes. They'll say, this patient has hard exudates there because as shown by the hyperreflectivity. And sometimes I just can't stand it. I just cut and say, how do you know those are hard exudates? Could that not be a scar? You know? And as I say to them, I mean, not to be mean, but Srinivas Sada, one of the foremost experts on OCT, just says it's hyper or hypo. He doesn't just look at one thing and says, that's a hard exudate. So he can't call it a hard exudate just by looking at, or he doesn't want to. Why is someone very junior doing that? So be careful, it's not all the same. So what do I mean? So this is a PED. We all agree, right? Okay, so it's hypo-reflective. This is quite different. This, we probably may not want to treat it as nothing else. This, whatever the pathology, probably some vascular thing, we will quite likely want to treat. So if you look at it, it's the same hypo-intensity, right? Doesn't necessarily, it's not equal. How about this? Outer retinal stimulation. Good. So you can see, and how do you tell? Because there's this hyper-reflective edge around it, whereas a typical cyst doesn't have that. Okay, but yes, it's been mistaken for cyst, and then you could be, no, if you're just chasing after this, you could be injecting and injecting, and it's not going to go away. Okay. How about this one? 40. But how about this one? Might be a cyst, right? So you see, but again, the intensity, well, in fact, this one is something inside even, but the fact is that they're not all the same. So be careful. So, I'm not sure, okay, I'm not sure, well, it seemed clearer on the screen, but I'm not sure if you agree, but I'm wondering whether there's something here. So remember, whether there's a bit of hypo-reflectivity. Is there a possible sliver of fluid? And again, you want to look at other cuts in order to tell that you can't entirely be sure just on one cut. But remember, so especially when it's a very complex distorted anatomy, you have to really be systematic and looking at it. Okay, so this is an illustration of the outer retinal tubulation and how it forms. So now then I mentioned, of course, you know that there are different OCT devices, and there are even more brands, right? And I just chose the more, I guess, common ones that we hear about, all right, in use. And I think what's important thing is, as I mentioned to you, the retinal thickness from each of these is different, okay? Because of the way they draw the segmentation lines. So it's inherently not comparable. So we did a comparison where we compared the spectralis with stratus. I know that, well, this was years ago, right? When we were still relevant, and we showed that the thickness, there was a very good correlation, but there was a gap between the spectralis, and we actually went to adjust the segmentation. Don't do that, don't bother, okay? But when we adjusted, then the correlation became 1-to-1. So, but you know, there's a different objective that what we're trying to show here, but I think it makes the point. Even choroidal thickness, when you're using point thickness, there's caliper measurements, okay? You notice that there can be a spread of differences between the different devices. In this case, we compared the DRI OCT, that was the Atlantis, the spectralis, as well as the Cirrus, right? And there are differences. And this was the same eye, same scans, all done by the same person. So we were looking for obvious landmarks, and there were differences in the measurements. So that's an important consideration. So I think that brings the point that, and kind of leads to the next talk, that don't rely on OCT. OCT is very useful, it's essential, but you've got other things that help you. All right? Autofluorescence, fluorescein, iridescent green angiograms. And now, as we'll talk more about it later, we've got multicolor and OCTA, as you've heard already. All of this can give you extra information. You may want to rely on this. So the pitfall is not to go around thinking that I only need an OCT, I can throw away my fluorescein and even an ICG angiogram. Or even a color fundus photo can start to give you information. You need to correlate. All right? So multimodal imaging, I think, is quite important. Okay, I think that's what I would have. Okay, so just to summarize, there are strengths, but there's also limitations. There isn't any one device or one imaging modality that is like, okay, this is the best for everything. Right, so any questions or comments, please?
Just had a doubt actually. The point was the image that you showed in which there was no pattern and later it turned out to be a myopic patient.
Yes.
When you go back to that image,
This one. Or you want this one? Yeah.
This one.
Okay.
So the point is, this is not showing any particular pattern, so it doesn't fit into.
Yes.
But when we go to the thickness map,
Yes.
now thickness map is looking normal here.
Which part of it? You mean
The average thickness, this one.
the central.
Yeah.
Yes.
The algorithm the machine will use will be the same, right? But how could these two things, the color map and the thickness map, show kind of what is the reason behind the two different things? Because machine is using the same algorithm.
Yes.
One becomes normal that you can imagine, okay, this patient should be normal. The other thing is showing something very haywire.
Right. So I think so. If you're talking about thickness maps and the values, well, if you notice within the central 1 millimeter circle, the thickness color is quite similar, and that's probably because the segmentation is all right there. But if you look at this region here, the outer temporal, the thickness is 433. That's probably a bit high, and I know it's not directly comparable, but compare with the nasal side, it's 351. So there's a difference there. Yeah, so there is a thickening as well. In fact, this thickness map on the same machine would reflect the color as it were. The color is just like a heat map representation. Yeah. So it depends on where the errors are. But one clue is you see lines like this, that's usually, unless you're taking some traction band that is perfectly horizontal, right? How often have we seen that, right? So it's usually because that's where the error is, right? So that's one of the indications.
So many studies are quantifying the choroidal thickness. How do you propose to measure the choroidal thickness? Because we really don't know the outer extent of the choroid. On the OCT, how can we
okay.
measure?
So on the OCT, you can actually get a good visualization. So this is a EDI OCT on the spectralis, which is spectral domain. And you can see that, okay, so this inner boundary is usually quite clear. That's the RPE Brooks membrane. But if you look at this, these are choroidal vessels, and then you see a fairly distinct line when the vessels stop. I agree that there's some of this undulation here, but in fact, I believe that this might be just part of the stroma of the choroid. So how I would measure this is, if I were doing the calipers, as I would take this point, I think we would all agree on this point, and then I'll draw it here. The question is, how much of the hyper-reflective part do I incorporate? I agree there's variability there. I would probably include just, because you can almost imagine a fairly smooth line coming down like this. All right. The way in my clinical research, how we do it, we assume a smooth line and we draw it to that point. Therefore, we assume that this is part of the boundary. But some others I know will feel that you should just follow the dark areas between the vessels.
Do you take the subfoveal region only, or you just measure the thickest part?
Typically, no, I think you need to have some frame of reference. So if you're taking one measurement, I will take sub-foveal. What others have done, we have done, but very time-consuming, is to measure at specific distances. I would say 500 microns laterally on either side, and then measure down again. So 500, 1,000, 1,000 microns, 1,005, and so on. But it's very, very time-consuming, and that will be only for the horizontal cut, presumably. Some have done horizontal and vertical. There is a way to actually get a choroidal thickness map. Okay, well, a thickness map like this. All right, and that is to actually adjust these lines down. So in this case, the machine has done it partly for you, but you can pull this line down, and then pull this line down to the RPE Brooks membrane, and you do that for all the cuts, which takes at least 45 minutes if you are fast. We have done that for research, but I would not recommend that for standard practice. Yeah, that's the way to do it. I will mention that the TopCon has automated choroidal segmentation for you. So you can get a thickness map just by pressing the button. All right? But I would urge you to look for potential segmentation errors. Any OCT machine has errors, so look for that. Because if you're not going to have big errors, it could affect the thickness machines. Yeah. Maybe I should just also mention that TopCon, you can actually get thickness maps on both the raster scans as well as the radial scans. But the radial scans, as you know, is just those cuts, and they're actually interpolating and the thicknesses in between. So the machine is just using some algorithm to assume that. So we can. Has anyone had any experiences with OCT, either pearls or pitfalls? And in a way, you realize that why the pitfalls seem to be longer. First of all, you want to avoid mistakes, but also a pearl is just avoid the pitfall, right? So anyone else has any comments that you'd like to share? Any experiences? I think it'd be useful because I'm sure you've had some as well.
Sir Colin, my hospital using the spectral domain, but after the surgery, I'm unable to associate patient with gas filled eye. What are the technique if you want to capture the good OCT in the gas filled eye?
Okay, that's a bit challenging. You can because the gas obviously contributes to a refractive component. You can try to adjust manually the focus. So it's like focusing because it's like having an extra lens there. So you might need to manually adjust. I think we've managed to do that serious, painstakingly moving in and out until you see the retina come into focus within that area, and then you capture it. It's definitely not going to be as good as a normal eye, but if you want some indication, then that would be one way. Again, in such a setting, I might recommend just taking a few quick line cuts rather than going for the 62 lines. Like, to posture the head. Yeah, well, I guess if you have it depends how big your gas field is, but if it's right at the midpoint, then it's going to be a problem, right? But then you might need to, if it's a half fill or this, yeah, you might need to adjust it a little bit. But ideally, you want a fairly consistent, either no gas or gas there. But if it's right at the boundary, then obviously you're going to have difficulties where it crosses from gas to gas.
So I have come across a paper where they have done wide-angle OCT imaging using +20 lens in the trial frame.
Okay.
So it gives about 188% more field of view. That's one easy way of converting a regular OCT into a wide-angle.
Right. Good point. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I think I remember seeing that. I haven't tried it. Have you tried it?
No, sir.
No, okay.
add on to that. The original paper is in video, it's by the Duke.
Okay.
And so they in fact have an excellent part of these things, and they have a customized actually arm that you can swing in, and they actually adjust it depending on the refractive error of the patient. So the images that they show in their original paper, they've actually been able to take the OCT all the way up to the OR.
Right.
I don't think that's reproducible in any clinical setting.
Right.
What I think you're trying to point out is just to have the patient wear the regular refractive trial frame and put a +10 diopter, lens in front of that, and then capture the image. Right? The issue with that is because of the refractive change, you're not able to see the infrared or the autofluorescence image. So you're basically just blindly trying to focus, and as soon as you get any semblance of a scan, just capture that. So the quality is not that great, but yes, you can magnify it quite a bit. So if you have that, let's say a 12mm scan on the regular machine, it can go up to about 16 to 18 millimeters.
Right.
But it's a blind procedure.
Sure.
Because the IR or the autofluorescence image is not there.
Sure. Good point. I think, yeah, actually to sort of, not entirely related to this, but sometimes if you're performing a scan yourself, if you have a difficult patient, either an uncooperative patient or limitations where you have to use a lens, the moment you get an image, it's like taking a photo, right? If you're trying to take a fast-moving object, you won't have time to focus and all that, compared to a patient a guy who's posing for you to take a photo. So if you get a chance, if you know that, just snap a photo. It's like a digital camera. You can just delete the useless ones later. Right? So sometimes you need to compromise and just get the best possible image. And anyone has any other any thoughts about how else what you do for OCT, either proactively or what you do to avoid mistakes? Not really. You have to tell your own mistakes. Tell others, especially the not so friendly competitors. But I think seriously, it's important. Look, I've made mistakes, okay, looking at stuff, and we all do. And I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of. I think what's important is that